This has been a very heavy week and a very heavy time. The virus is still present, the future still unclear. Dealing with this pandemic is a consistent reminder of how much we don't know. When will there be a second wave? Do antibodies provide immunity? When will there be a vaccine? Fear and anxiety can lead to frustration and anger. And then suddenly another plague strikes. And we watch horrified as George Floyd lies on the ground pleading for breath as he slowly dies. The police officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes while he choked out, "I can't breathe," until he died. And yet this plague is not sudden. It comes not from China nor anywhere else. It's made in America. For too many, it is how we see the world, a form of colorblindness that allows us to pass over the injustice in our society. And on the same day that George Floyd was killed, another incident occurred in Central Park in New York City. Christian Cooper, an African-American man, was bird watching when he encountered an unleashed dog. He asked the dog's owner, Amy Cooper, no relation, a white woman, to put the dog on a leash as the park rules require. When she did not, he began to film her. In response, Amy Cooper said that she would call the police, stating, "I'm going to tell them there is an African-American man threatening my life," while pulling out her cell phone and calling 911. Amy Cooper was tapping in to the reality of racial injustice that creates immense pain and challenge in the lives of millions of Black Americans, pain that most of us have no clue about. Amy Cooper knew that we live in a world where bias and hate towards people with Black skin is so pervasive that it reaches even into individuals with a badge. And Black Americans have good reason to fear that attention turned towards them can have dire consequences just based on the color of their skin. The nationwide protests that are lighting our world on fire are terrifying and awful. However, it's vital that we recognize that at their core, these protests represent a genuine and legitimate frustration over decades-long failure to reform police practices and the broader criminal justice system in the United States. The overwhelming majority of participants have been peaceful, courageous, responsible, and inspiring. They deserve our respect and our support, not condemnation, something that police across the country have understood. Like Erica Shields, the police chief in Atlanta, who walked the streets with protesters, talking to everyone. On the other hand, the small minority of folks who've resorted to violence in various forms, whether out of genuine anger or mere opportunism, are putting innocent people at risk, compounding the destruction of neighborhoods that are already short on services and investment, and detracting from the larger cause. So we cannot excuse violence or rationalize it. If we want our criminal justice system and American society at large to operate on a higher ethical code, then we have to model that code ourselves. As we enter into Shabbat, how do we reflect on the state of the world that has been highlighted this week in a way that lets God enter into the space, and our reality? In our weekly Torah portion, we are given the oldest blessing in our tradition, the threefold blessing, the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing. I'd like us to consider reading this blessing as an invitation to engage with the darkness that surrounds us and the promise of the light that awaits. The first verse, Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless you and protect you. This is a blessing for safety and security. On one level, we look to physical solutions for our safety, being careful and cautious to not catch this virus, using our voices in ways that are clear and direct and not antagonistic, having armed protection through law enforcement to keep our streets safe. But while this security is important, it's not the kind that brings blessing, Yevarechecha. On the holiday of Sukkot, we dwell in a temporary structure that is open on all sides to community. The ritual observance is a testimony to the reality that true security comes from relationships, the interconnections that are the God presence in our lives. That means that for those of us who are white, or those of us who are Jewish, or those of us who are just part of our temple family, we need to make this our problem. We need to work together to form deep and meaningful relationships with local communities across lines of faith and race in order to better understand the issues that will impact us all and to be in solidarity for movements with racial justice and inequality. The second verse, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka. May God illuminate God's face and grace you. What does it mean that we want God to grace us? Today, I interpret this to mean that God's grace is the motivation and knowledge to be God's voice and God's hands in this dark world. Each one of us can ask, how can I help prevent the spread of this coronavirus? It's normalized and contributes to a pattern of accepting discrimination, hate, and injustice in society. When we challenge those biased attitudes and behaviors in ourselves, in others, and institutions, we can interrupt the escalation of bias and make it more difficult for discrimination to flourish. Since the elected officials who matter most in reforming police departments and the criminal justice system work at the state and local levels, how can I cast my vote at the ballot box in ways that support criminal justice reform that addresses issues of bias and discrimination. It's mayors and county executives that appoint most police chiefs and negotiate collective bargaining agreements with police unions. It's district attorneys and state attorneys that decide whether or not to investigate and ultimately charge those involved in police misconduct. Those are all elected positions in which we can play a part. God, grace me to be your voice in this area. And finally, the last verse, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God lift up God's face to you and establish for you peace and wholeness. I want to read this last verse as a result of the first two. When we establish deep security through relationships, when we open to God's grace through being an instrument for God's presence in the world through action, then we merit God's face and God's peace. The verse says, may God lift up God's face to you. Think about looking in the airport for someone you love who's just arriving. There are so many people walking past you, their heads down, focused on their destination. And then one person lifts his head and you see that it's your loved one and you experience immense joy in your reunion. Every so often, we have the opportunity for God to lift up God's face in another person, in a situation, and we know that God's presence is with us. This is the shalom that the blessing promises. We have so much to navigate right now as a human race when the future is always uncertain. God wants us to be partners in creation, and that means beholding the beauty of this creation as God does. But it also means that to be a instrument of God's grace and work, it also means jumping in to be an instrument for God's grace and work towards the world that we want to see. Shabbat Shalom.
Please join us on Facebook Live or YouTube Live or our custom streaming channel. We'll see you there for services starting in just a minute.